I haven't used the phrase shiver me timbers in a long time, or ever, actually, but the personification of death in Puss in Boots: The Last Wish calls for it. It's not just his intimidating presence, but the complex and layered motives that make him truly sadistic. Head over to Reddit and you'll find people still questioning whether he's simply a force of nature or an actual villain. We've covered Jack Horner before and how he's evil for evil's sake. Interestingly, he's only one of 3 villains in the film. Normally, a film would find it hard to juggle 3 bad guys, and you'd expect the film to be a mess, but you'd be wrong. But how did a wolf become one of the most terrifying villains we've seen in animated cinema? And what can we learn from this character to create our own inevitable, terrifying, and redeemable villain? We'll find out. The interesting thing about Wolf is that he has no backstory. He's a reaper who goes door to door collecting souls, but the movie still manages to make him into such a layered and complex character. How does it manage that? We need to contextualize his target, Puss in Boots. As Puss defeats the sleeping giant of Del Mar, we realize that he has no concern for his own life, because, well, cats have 9 lives. And when the bell drops on him at the end, the ball drops as well.
That makes 8, Puss. You are down to your last life.
These events set up the plot of the film. Puss comes face to face with his mortality and starts his pursuit of the wishing star to reclaim it. Our hero's first step? Denial. But it doesn't take long before he's roused out of it. Drinking yet another evening away, Puss is confronted not just by the thought of death, but the embodiment of it. But this clash with death starts off rather mildly. We realize that something is fishy about the wolf as he appears out of thin air next to the cat. While his sudden arrival next to a pouting puss smells fishy, his mysterious demeanor makes us interested in him. What really hooks the audience is how he casually strikes a conversation with our hero.
You are no bounty hunter. You are death.
Despite his mysterious nature, he comes off as nothing more than a stranger in a bar. Maybe someone we've all shared the odd drink with at some point in our lives. But that's exactly why our parents told us to be wary of strangers. The movie that had lulled us into a sense of security now bared its teeth. The wolf extends a bounty poster with his sharp nail signaling Puss's fate. But it's not just his appearance that puts us off, it's his entire demeanor. Rarely do we see kids' movies so heavily focused around the theme of death, mostly because they're freaking kids' movies. But apparently, director Joel Crawford and DreamWorks Animations were out of ducks to give. And we know that it was a conscious decision because this is not a character from an old book or folktale. This is an original creation of the film's writers. To understand why death is so well placed in this beautifully crafted world, we have to come to terms with the fact that, generally, death has no purpose. It's devoid of meaning. What gives it meaning is its mere opposite, the weight of the lived life. And the film has that in spades. But how this life is presented to us, in a joyous, rambunctious manner, is incredibly clever. A card at the film's beginning establishes a key sentiment, telling us that what we're about to see is nothing but a fairy tale. At first, this doesn't seem out of the ordinary. It might not seem like a big deal, but the card is a clever piece of misdirection. And it's not just that one card. The first scene shows a wishing star falling into a forest, a perfect setup for a wholesome ride. And who do you think needs a wish more than anyone? Our rowdy, scrawny, jolly hero, Puss in Boots. By this point, everybody's thinking, oh, what sweet fun. Now, you've got a good reason for believing this. The Shrek films were wholesome adventures, and so was the original Puss in Boots film. We're acquainted with this universe and know what to expect. But then...
You are down to your last life.
Once death strikes the fear of God in the same Puss in Boots who...
I laugh at death!
He scurries away like a rat, waddling through gutters, gasping for another chance at life. After a short stint at an old cat lady's house, Puss sets out for the wishing star to restore his 9 lives. Who'd help him out of this rut? Friends. Duh. Journeying alongside his ex with trust issues and a friendly dog, and facing off against the two other villains of the film, Puss undergoes major changes. Changes that would help shape not only his character arc, but also bring about his courageous and defiant stand against death at the end of the film. But what makes the character of Death particularly sinister? The attire and character design? The predatory stare? The whistling? Well, in my opinion, it's a combination of a few things. Most people believe that the wolf is not a villain. There is some validity to this argument. Many argue that he's just doing his job, and to some extent that makes sense. In our initial encounter with him, we learn that...
But no one's escaped me yet.
Sounds like death to me. Nice try, folks, but this is not the case. The claims of Wolf not being a villain are overblown. Proponents of the force of nature theory argue that he can be reasoned with, bargained with, has a ton of biases, and is clearly sadistic. So he must simply be an element of nature. But it's a matter of semantics. If nature can be evil, and he is an evil force of nature, that makes him a villain. His organic nature does not mean that he's allowed to change the laws of causation. Everyone is fated to die at a specific time, but the wolf goes out of his way to fulfill his thirst before Puss's time is up. He is clearly overstepping his boundaries to please himself. This makes his motivations out of tune with the natural order of things. What struck me here so much was how much the film plays around with the portrayal of death. Normally in literature, theater, and visual arts, including movies, you have an indifferent reaper who cares little for the souls of the damned. After all, he's been doing it for a long time. This is just another Tuesday to him, and that's a force of nature, a reliable, predictable, inevitable harbinger of fate that will arrive in time to do the deed. It doesn't tease, it doesn't struggle, it doesn't do it for any other motives other than the fact that it must. But in The Last Wish, we see a very different vision of death. This wolf is out for blood, and the energy he gives off is just... very intimidating, to say the least. We know that this isn't just a force of nature. This is a fiend who's actively invested in Puss's fate. The sinister creature bludgeons and slashes his way through the establishment in their first meeting, bringing Puss real close to his 9th and final death. And when he says,
I just love the smell of fear.
As thunder strikes and his sickles grate against the floor, boy do I get goosebumps. But why does he have an agenda against our hero? This clearly isn't just another Tuesday to him because he chases the cat over multiple days. If that's how death operated in real life, there'd be a death once every Thursday or something. Death makes his ambitions known in the scene inside the Cave of Lost Souls. Here, Puss encounters his past 8 lives and how he wasted his years with the most minuscule and stupid things. The wolf appears here and reveals to Puss that his arrogance may have gotten him this far, but it was as far as it would lead him. He then proceeds to shatter the crystals one by one, each symbolizing one of Puss's past lives. It's the wolf's motivations, so different from any other embodiment of death we've ever seen on the screen, that make him so magnetic. Contrary to his average raping journey, this time he's out with a vengeance. He wants to make Puss pay for wasting his 8 lives away. He wants to kill him before his time is up. This personification of death flips the script. Take the portrayal of death in every other film. Like the famous chess scene from The Seventh Seal. In movies, death declares the sequence of events, a chain of causation that will happen no matter what. But here, the wolf cannot do that. He's not following that chain of causation. He's actively trying to distort it. He has a goal, one that can be foiled should the wishing star grant Puss's wish for 9 lives. When have we ever heard the angel of death failing to collect the soul? It never happens, not in myths, not in stories, not in folklore. But here, Puss escapes the first time around. It's quickly established that failure is a real possibility, simply because death is not waiting around for his fated time. It's an active force in the world. He wants Puss's soul now, and that involves taking out the sickles to go after the cat. All this means that stakes are high, not just for the doomed Puss in Boots, but also the wolf who's out for his blood. He's in a struggle as much as the hero. He's annoyed at Puss's arrogance. There is something about this legendary outlaw's reckless disregard for life that has agitated him so. A change has occurred, riling him out of the slumber of his day-to-day duties. Just as Puss's nonchalant adventures has spurred the wolf out of his predictable life, so does another choice at the end of the film change him once again. When Puss finally understands the importance of living, he stops fearing death and grounds himself in the present. And much to the surprise of the viewers, the wolf walks away. It was a particularly interesting twist for me, but one that still maintained an air of plausibility. Initially, you think, why would the Reaper ever let someone go? That doesn't make any sense. But the more you look at it and reflect, the more you realize that the film was giving you the signs all along. The wolf was in it for the hunt. He was in it for the fun of it. If this was just another one of his many errands, maybe the film's events would have come across as low stakes. When Death realizes that Puss has learned his lesson of acceptance, he can't keep up. He then confesses that he was after an arrogant little legend who thought he was immortal. But Puss is no longer that person. Just as Puss in Boots' vile snobbery falls to pieces, so does Death's interest in taking his life. Even though he overpowers everybody and would eventually get to him, he still respects the journey Puss has been on and the change it has brought in him. All this makes for an unusually multidimensional cartoon villain. But how did he change Puss? We've just seen how Puss affects and dictates the wolf's actions, establishing his arc. But the other side of the coin is just as interesting. The change in Puss's values was brought forth due to the arrival of Death. It was the thought of his own mortality, an idea that the cat had never grappled with before, that forced him to have a new perspective on life. The same cat who'd thrown away 8 lives now undertakes the most dangerous journey of his life, setting him on a crash course with fate. In most films, the hero's intent is set up halfway through the film. I have to destroy the villain, or I have to save the city. These are okay for the most part, but since the antagonist is so uniquely connected to the hero's own sense of self-worth, it makes us doubly invested in the story. Puss cannot defeat Death, and he cannot save himself from it. All that's left to do is accept his fate. His fear of mortality is the one and only incentive that makes him question his long-held beliefs. It is the impetus that snowballs one change after another in his life. And even though he initially tries to shrug off the dog and snatch the map from Kitty because Puss in Boots walks alone, he inevitably gives up. Fear makes him vulnerable and more reliant on those around him, helping establish arcs for multiple characters. The existential crisis forces Puss toward introspection and hence becomes the main driver of the story. At the end of the day, despite his deviance from the norm, the wolf is still a personification of death, this idea we grapple with on a day-to-day basis. That whistling wolf is the fear that pushes the entire story into motion, and the fact that he is the literal manifestation of Puss's nightmares means that his actions do not take away from the protagonist. If anything, they add to the agency of our hero. DreamWorks deliberately chose a wolf as his embodiment. But why? Well, wolves are coursing predators, since they run their prey to death. Few managed to escape them, but the filmmakers were not happy with that. For animated characters, everything must be exaggerated to drive the point home. What could be more intimidating than a wolf gliding across the landscape to gouge on your body, you ask? Well, a wolf who stands on 2 hind legs, towering over our comparably feeble protagonist. Shout out to DreamWorks for making sure parents have to clean their kids' beds over the next few nights. I'm telling you, they did not hold back on this character. Not only does the wolf tower over Puss, but he is also much quicker. Even if the hero could trick him, he is highly adaptable. When in a tiff, he can call upon his pyromancy skills, as well as combine his sickles to form a dual-handed polearm. Going to so many lengths to showcase his different abilities, despite being invincible, not only makes him OP, but also one nasty fucker. And that's all before that harrowing whistle comes into play. The motif arrives like an ominous siren, washing away the warm, colorful attires of the other characters, villains included. brooding and mysterious hues take over the screen. The haunting visual motifs hang over Puss's head even after he escapes from the villain's grasp. And there's good reason for this. Since Puss's friends fail to see him over the film's multiple encounters, it is implied that Death can turn invisible when he wants to. The wolf's set pieces are short, but those few seconds count. As they say, imagination fills in the gaps. For instance, even when he's not around, in the back of our minds, we're still aware of his gaze. He stands stoically like a seasoned hunter in the wild, the kind of figure who can disappear in the crowd and no one would notice. This makes him eerily close to the idea of death. It's all around us every day, but we rarely take the time to reflect upon it. It hits a little too close to home, if you ask me. While there are great villains out there that follow a similar rhyme and reason, this Death is different. It's a unique character, unlike anything we've seen in a children's film before. So how do you write such an intriguing character, especially an original one? In my opinion, here are a few things that make Death stand out that can be explored in other works as well. A lot of villains give us the impression that they're invincible. They control the corporate sector, the jobs, the economy, the media, or all the analogous institutions of their universe. But they are fallible. Most of them have a critical flaw, one that eventually gets figured out. They seem infallible not because they are, but because they initially appear to be. Where The Last Wish upends the whole formula is that it tells us from the get-go this is the personification of death. We know that this villain cannot be defeated. He cannot be escaped. He is a reckoning force of nature, coming full steam to a theater near you. The fact that it is rooted in a universal idea makes it hard to separate the concept from the character. And since we recognize and acknowledge the inevitability of death, we also come to terms with the fact that death won't just go away. So not only does the film start us off with quite a relatable premise, it establishes a key point for us and for Puss. You can't win against everything. This leads Puss on an emotional journey to discover that truth for himself, and we tag along for the ride. We know that death is inevitable, but it's the fact that it arrives much earlier than it's supposed to that throws us off. Now, it's not easy to sell that for obvious reasons. It seems exaggerated and, ironically, cartoony. What makes a villain truly terrifying is that they have plausible motivations for their missions. This lends them a sense of being grounded. Passions like destroying the planet are outrageous and pull us out of the narrative, but something personal engages us on a deeper level. Great villains don't do something because they saw it in a dream. They do it because they're fueled by a need for change in themselves and in those around them. In The Last Wish, Death isn't there to do his duties. He has been led astray by his passion to devour an arrogant outlaw. And it's not an entirely stupid passion either. It's very much understandable that Puss's egotism and pride gives him the ick. So even though the wolf is stalking him out of contempt, his chase doesn't make him foreign and irredeemable to us. Most villains threaten to destroy a person, a location, or a thing that is somehow important to the protagonist. These threats, while real, pose merely a physical threat. The psychological impact of these actions comes in proportion to the value attributed to said person, location, or thing. But what if the physical harm was imminent? What if the body was going to wither away no matter what? The threat then becomes predictable. It becomes uninspired. So what should be done now? This is where direct psychological impact comes in. A villain like the wolf does not simply threaten to kill Puss. Even though he does do that, he makes him take stock of his past actions. So the psychological impact of the story comes not from any associations, it comes from the existential crisis within. Death here threatens something much worse than physical harm. It threatens to invalidate Puss's existence, his actions, and his core values. The idea that everything he's done in his entire life has been a waste of time and energy, how he's wasted precious moments, this irks Puss more than any blade or scythe ever could. Death appears on the screen for a handful of moments, but boy does the film make the most of those moments. The fact that the villain relates to a universal idea means that the filmmakers don't need to rely on constant threats. They don't need to bludgeon us with cruelty to get the point across. They just need to invoke the very real, omnipresent fear that lives rent-free in our heads. Add some S-tier art style, visuals, and costume work, et voila! You ruin children's childhoods. Wolf's presence is calm and collected for the most part, but when he strikes, everything seems larger than life. The robe flying through the air adds dynamism, and his rounded weapons add flair that the otherwise boring weapons would have lacked. The large pointy ears and red eyes top off his whole aura. The death from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is one of the darkest and most unique villains in animation history. His vengeful spirit has a thirst of blood, which is highly uncharacteristic of the stereotypical Grim Reaper. He has been risen out of his slumber, and it's another evil, the evil of vanity and self-obsession, that has forced him to commit his evils. He will get his way eventually, but he is driven by the passion to wipe the smug off Puss's face. He does not bother justifying his actions. He's there to do, as he himself says, play with his food. Once the excitement of the chase wears off, his gluttony goes away as well. And to those still convinced that he's not a villain, go suck a thumb.